Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm so delighted to welcome you to today's seminar. We have a short, sharp hour, so it's going to be a focused discussion. I'm Liz Gillies, CEO of the Menzies Foundation. The Menzies Foundation aspires to build a leadership movement that asks Australians to reflect on leadership, pivot to their purpose, build their leadership capability and contribute to the greater good. We do this work by identifying leadership challenges and building multi-sector incubators to address those challenges. And one of our very serious focus areas is school leadership. We initiated the Menzies School Leadership Incubator in 2019, and over the last 4 years, through the pandemic, the incubator has worked with 15 outstanding school leaders to explore leadership with a particular focus on collective efficacy. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to launch the 2022 Menzies School Leader Incubator Insights Report. And I'm just so delighted to have the opportunity to discuss the incubator's journey, our most recent insights around collective efficacy with our esteemed panel members. So joining us today is Professor John Hattie, who literally requires no introduction, John. It's delightful and we're very grateful that you're here today. Kerry Elliott, who is an extraordinary backbone leader of the Menzies School Leadership Incubator. Kerry is a Senior Research Fellow at the Education Policy and Practice at ASA. And at least two of our school leaders, and I'm hoping the third one is going to join us, Michelle Carroll, Principal at St Catherine School, Nick Lovering, Principal of Catherine High School, and when Karen Snipson joins us, I will look forward to introducing you to her then. So the incubator, all our incubators are built on the lived experience of the leaders facing the challenge that we address in our work. And no group have been more important to us than, as I said, the 15 outstanding leaders who are members of the incubator, two of which are with us today. So I would start perhaps with you, Nick. Tell us a little bit about your school leadership journey and the sort of challenges that you face as a leader in your school context. You're on mute, Nick. You have to unmute yourself.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, it's great to be joining you. Look, I've been a school leader here in the Northern Territory for about 15 years. I started my career overseas in England. And yeah, I came to the Northern Territory in 2006, and I've worked in a variety of different contexts across the Northern Territory, from living in remote Aboriginal community to remote rural contexts, and then as a school leader here in Catherine for the last 12 years. And within Catherine town itself, I've had the opportunity to experience a real range of opportunities in terms of schools, urban Aboriginal school environments to predominantly non-Aboriginal environment in my last school, where Professor Hattie has actually come and had a tour, and then currently at our single and only high school here in Catherine, which is a wonderful melting pot of Catherine. And so it's been a pleasure for me to join the incubator and join Menzies and to share my experiences and to talk about those things which have the biggest impact. And then also, I suppose, to be able to share my challenges from my context, which I think have some unique attributes.
So Nick, tell us, so what are tell me some, it's very clear that there are significant challenges in leading schools today. Level of complexity, the demands on leaders, the amount of stress leaders report, the number of people that are reluctant to step into principals' roles. Talk a little bit about those challenges, Nick.
Oh, look, I think for me, the biggest challenge that we're facing as a leader is probably the equity in terms of the funding of our public schools, and trying to deploy resources in a way in which we can achieve the results that we want to achieve for the young people that are in front of us. I suppose I've seen a bit of a shift here in the Northern Territory around some of our families not choosing public education, and that's been a challenge in terms of then keeping our enrolment high, keeping our resourcing high, and then getting the right staff, and also then growing the next generation of leaders that are wanting to invest in becoming a school leader here in the Northern Territory. So that's been a challenge in terms of the personal workload and the pressure. My particular context means that I'm coming into contact with a range of stakeholders, a very diverse range of stakeholders, whether they be traditional owners of the country on which I work, of which there's currently 3 main groups involved in a really long and protracted land claim over the township of Katherine, to families that are living in Katherine for a various range of reasons. So being able to cater to that diverse context is a real challenge. And then, all those other challenges with living in a remote town, trying to find teachers to come and live in Katherine, trying to get teachers once they come to Katherine to stay in Katherine. And then also trying to deal with system pressure as well. So system priorities. Sometimes I feel like the Northern Territory might devalue at the expertise that we have here. And we sometimes take that opportunity to take something from a different context or a different state, and we say this should work here, when we probably need to really allow our educators the time to build their expertise within the context that they're working, and have that time to reflect on what's best practice for us here. And that may look, and it's okay for it to look different and stylized in a way that supports the learners that are in front of us. So I suppose those system priorities sometimes can present a challenge for principals trying to keep pace with what's next.
So Michelle, the incubator's been very it gives great consideration to the sorts of challenges that Nick's outlined, the role of leading yourself, leading in your school, leading in the system. Michelle joined the incubator as in our second cohort of school leaders. Just before we get into the findings in the report, tell us a little bit about what you've learned about the sorts of leadership attributes you're focused on cultivating as a leader in managing that complexity of your own leadership in your school and leadership in the system.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of the webinar as well. I think the incubator has been a great opportunity for me to sort of grow my own leadership. I'm in my 9th year in the role, and, I see it being increasingly complex. So I very much agree with what you were saying there. I think teachers really need to first and foremost have an approach of adaptability, particularly post-COVID. And I think that complexity comes from, needing to embed technology, levels of risk, wellbeing, learning, very full syllabus, particularly if you're teaching year 11 and 12. So, the job in encouraging staff and supporting staff in that really complex classroom environment, I think, has just, been tenfold since we've sort of moved through the last 2 years. I think some of the key leadership qualities, it needs to be, one needs to have a really clear sense of purpose, but it actually needs to be more than that. There needs to be, from a principal's point of view, a really strong narrative around this, so that you as a leader, you're taking people with you, on that journey. And I mean staff, students and parents with that sense of purpose. And I think the other leadership quality is really just having an intellectual curiosity. sort of really an interest and a knowledge in other people's work. I think by and large schools, are great places for teachers to be doing their work with, their students in their classroom. And we sort of know what they're doing, but we don't really have a deep knowledge of that. So I think there's this curiosity about what's happening in the classroom in your school. And I think the professional learning teams and the collective efficacy structure really enables a bit of a deeper dive into that. And that's what I've been able to do, across the last 18 months. And it's been interesting. It's embedded a common language of learning at St Catherine's and some really lift in collegiality as well. So it's been strong. It's been good, a great process.
Thanks, Fashion. So which John brings me to you. To be honest, John, the work of the incubator was very, very heavily influenced by your consideration of the factors that are the greatest predictors of improving student learning outcomes. Perhaps naively, John, I assumed that collective efficacy was far more tangible and far more approachable as a concept and as a strategic pillar in underpinning school leadership. And yet the work of the incubator, I think, has reinforced how elusive it can be. And I just was wondering if perhaps we could start, before we get into the insights of the reports, given that collective efficacy is accepted globally and in Australia as fundamentally important in building and improving, it's been a predictor for what can improve student outcomes, given that all the Menzies Foundation work in leaders prioritises collaborative capacity, being able to cultivate great teams who leverage multiple expertises. Given all those things, why is collective efficacy so elusive? Why is it hard to implement? And yet, finally, John, why is it so fundamentally important to the way we need to reframe or reimagine leadership in Australian schools?
Well, Liz, what impresses me about the work that you folk are doing is that you have taken on the toughest, the hardest, the elusive. But yes, you're right. One of the most powerful influences that we have. And the notion of collective efficacy, it underpins a lot of the top influences. Some people mistake it as it sits on itself. It's not. It is underpinning. It underpins that relentless focus that we all want to have on the learning lives of kids. It underpins the relationships, the trust that is necessary, particularly for us to say as educators, hey, we need to improve. We may not have got it right. We make mistakes. We don't get everything solved. And that willingness, that confidence, that ability to critique others, critique ourselves, to be critiqued, to have notions about how we think. Because one of the big arguments I've certainly continually made, it's not what educators do, it's how they think about what they do. And sometimes that's a little scary when people question how you think. It's much easier to critique something in front of you than the actual person. But the hardcore reality is that the reason we do such an excellent job in our schools is the expertise and the ways of thinking of our educators. And so we know that this whole notion of collective efficacy, as you've said, Liz, is endemic and powerful in other businesses and others, but in ours it also too. But here's the other one. The employers are asking of our graduates that they can think collectively, they can work in teams. So if we don't get it right as educators in our staff rooms, what chance in our classrooms? So it is a tough one. It's not as easy as just saying we're going to be collective, we're going to sit in a group, we're going to collaborate. And it comes back to a lot of the tough things, like in our own work, we spent a number of years exploring collective efficacy. I have to confess, we did not succeed very well. And we had to stop. And we paused and changed the whole focus to ask, and it was safer, what about collective efficacy in students? And so we worked on that, and we were able to do a lot more studies, and it was a lot easier for us to do. And it showed us that with students, and I think it applies for adults as well, we have to know that success is a function not just of us, but of us and the group and the group. And that's hard. So this is the hardest stuff. But if you look at all the research, if you want to see the best way to make a dramatic difference in the fastest possible time to the most number of kids, it's all summed up in this notion of collective efficacy.
John, I think what has been really interesting in the work of the incubator is it seems that collective efficacy has been thought of as a project or an activity versus an underpinning strategic pillar that shapes who you lead, how you lead, and what the context in which you lead is. And that's been one of the really serious breakthroughs of our work, I think, in the incubator, to see it as part of the context of providing a context in which to lead versus saying we're doing collective efficacy because we've got this activity or that activity. And that's quite a fundamental shift, I think.
It is. It's a way of thinking. It's when you walk into that staff room, it's who you are when you walk in. Are you a listener? Are you prepared to engage in turn taking? Are you prepared to seek not only the advice, but the critique of your fellows so that together we can come up with better ways to making a difference? And that's a way of being, that's a way of thinking, and you're so right. And then, of course, there's lots of skills underneath it, but sometimes you can see those leaders who are prepared to be in the collective and those that are the independent contractor that want to run it because they have the autonomy and right to run the school as they wish.
Just everything. One of the things that characterises the Menzies Foundation incubators is multi-sector collaborations, where we bring perspectives from a range of different sectors to address leadership challenges, to encourage non-siloed thinking and open up new innovation. It gives me really great pleasure, because she's indispensable and simply marvellous, to introduce Kerry Elliott, who is our Grand Poobah leader, who manages, frankly, we practice collective efficacy in the incubator, don't we, Kerry? Who guides us and leads us in that context. Kerry, can you perhaps start just by explaining a little bit about the incubator and the work that we've done, and then perhaps share some of the really the high-level insights from the report?
Thanks, Lizzie. Thanks, everyone. And John and Lizzie, I think you've stole our thunder a little bit in terms of some of the key insights that have come out through the report, which I hope everyone will have access to following this webinar. Yeah, the incubator really is a deep dive into an inquiry that we have together around how we might build a pipeline of school leaders who, touching what Michelle and Nick have just pointed to around how do we build this pipeline to build collective efficacy in the complex and challenging contexts that schools are. So part of the incubator, I guess, process is really us all getting messy within these sandpits to trial, to test things, to find out things. And over this full 4-year period, we've had different cohorts and different groups of school leaders that we've had the great privilege to work alongside and learn with and learn from. And through that work, we've generated hours and hours of observations and discussions and insights. But as Liz mentioned before, it's a cross collaboration across the industry as well. So we have an advisory board that we work with, and also different people in different sectors and non-for-profits, other industries as well, that kind of shed light on what's happening in their spaces, but helping us try and work through and understand better our own space, because sometimes you need to step outside almost to see what's inside. So I think that's been really a core part of the work that we've done. So the report, which I hope you'll all have access to reading after this webinar, is really just a few of the key insights, which I know Liz and John has touched on a little bit. Was one of them is this idea about reimagining school leadership. So when we talk about school leadership, we've talked about leaders in terms of leaders' individual mindsets and behaviours, but also leadership. How do we intentionally and deliberately develop both of those? So when we talk about leadership, we talk about developing relationships, developing, understanding the systems and the context within which we work. And I know Karen, who you haven't had an opportunity to be introduced to, which I know we'll hear a little bit about her context as well, about seeing yourself as a grower of other leaders within your school as well. So we talk really deliberately and intentionally about how do we develop leaders and leadership within our context, and building the skills for that transformational change, and what John picked up on it before about that deepening that collaborative capacity. that's one of the key insights. The other one was really around this understanding collective efficacy a little bit more in terms of how we might support and develop it and cultivate it in schools. I know John and team have tackled the student collective efficacy. We took on the big challenge of tackling what does it look like in schools and how do leaders deliberately and intentionally develop collective efficacy. As we said before, it is an elusive term. If we think about where collective efficacy came from and Albert Bandura's original work in collective efficacy, his role was looking at teams and working out how teams were working together to achieve particular goals. And he found that there were some teams who dug a little bit deeper, you know, who are a little bit more resilient, who set higher expectations. When the going got tough, they continued to persevere and work their way through those challenges to learn with and from each other to achieve that goal. And that's where that term collective efficacy came from. It's been shifted and changed and different people have elaborated on that, but and I know John has added in with evidence of impact, but how we've thought about collective efficacy is this ability for staff to work together to believe, enact and grow their collective capabilities to positively impact student outcomes. And part of the work that we've done is started looking at, well, what are these essential ingredients? You know, what's the essence of collective efficacy and what are the leadership practices that leaders are engaging in to help cultivate it in their schools? We've come up with these hypothesis around, and Michelle touched on this as well, one of them, curiosity. So being a curious leader, you know, asking lots of questions to get people really collaborating and thinking together. Intellectual humility, you'll read across the literature and across the landscape, this ability to be vulnerable, to step in and say, you know what, I don't have all the answers and we actually do need to work on these challenges and work through different solutions together. And the other one is, John touched on it as well, is that collective will and the collective skill. So when we talk about collective will, we talk about this notion of really believing and valuing the power of the collective and the skill set. So the skill sets to actually collaborate and work with each other, but also the skill sets around the practice. Yeah. So that quality teaching and learning. So having those skills to have those discussions around that aspect, but also the skills to actually listen, turn, take, hear other people. So there's some of the key things, and we pointed it out before around that collective efficacy is a strategic pillar. So in the report we talked to it being thinking about that idea of a mindset, a skill set and a tool set. So as leaders in schools, we're thinking about how do we influence or you know, think about the mindset of the people we're working with, but also the skill set and the tool set, not just relying on the tools, but also thinking about, I guess, that triangle. We know a triangle is really strong in its structure. So thinking about kind of that as that strategic pillar to be that guiding force of what we're doing.
And Karen, it's just lovely to welcome you. Karen was one of our first fellows and has made such a powerful contribution to our work. Perhaps, Karen, this might be a good opportunity for you to reflect on the way the incubator has contributed to how you think about collective efficacy in your school.
I would say the incubator really has created the moral imperative to take that deep dive, because my absolute belief, and you're correct, John, is efficacy building is not a program. You can't buy it. It's not achieved easily. It's about creating an ethos and a belief about how you work as a team of staff and how you work and learn together. And so reimagining how that occurs has really been how we go about our work here in our school, and it really has changed us from the inside out, and in a way that we're incredibly proud of in terms of building staff capacity to create a question, to formulate a strategy, to try it, to learn from each other, to create that opportunity to be brave enough to take a risk and make a mistake, and to do that from an evidence-informed practice, but to make that core practice across the school, not in silos and not in pockets. And so for us, that change has been quite revolutionary. One of the things that we have here at school is a set of staff commitments, and I had a wry smile on my face, and I wrote it down because I thought, oh, I love it when I hear our staff commitments come back at me. But one of our staff commitments is that we learn from and with each other, and that we have that willingness to do it. You know, as a team of leaders in which we expect all of our people to be doing that, we very much step into the place of co-constructing our strategies for improvement. And I think the very, very first time I considered that notion of co-constructing an idea, it was exhilarating and terrifying.
And I say, Karen, you know, we have always, I think in the incubator's first days, we thought about leadership and then collective efficacy. The big shift for us is collective efficacy is the sandpit in which to grow as a leader, to learn the leadership attributes and skill sets that you need to lead in the complexity of the roles as principals in schools. It's the context in which I think we've learned it provides the foundation to build collaborative capacity skills, to explore team leadership, to think about what transformational change looks like, and how to take your team with you. Michelle, how's that playing out at St Catherine's for you? Because I hear with great interest that the way that you're thinking about collective efficacy is also being influential in what you're doing in your school.
Yeah, thanks. I guess first and foremost, I probably endorse Kerry's words about, you know, understanding with humility your own journey here. And I think in many ways, as principals, we're role model for staff to be able to reflect on your own capacity, you know, as a learner, as a leader, and in role modeling that, you're encouraging staff to do that as well. I think adult learning, you know, is not lockstep, and every staff member's on a different pathway. And I think that sort of adds to the complexity of this as well. You know, I've really focused on developing some middle leaders of collective efficacy and of professional learning. So I've tried to sort of seek the skills of staff that are already in the school, and that's been able to sort of been really exciting, building leadership capacity in others, and have been what they've been able to do. Some of the things that I've noticed is that, you know, staff and teachers need to talk their way through the collective efficacy, but it needs to be guided conversations. And I think the value of PLT coaches at St Catherine's has been, you know, quite remarkable this year. And I don't think we would have been able to do it without that. So, you know, some of the Menzies opportunities has enabled the capacity building of my middle leaders at school, which is then sort of scaffolded down to the teaching staff as well. But I think really it's about asking teachers to reflect on their capacity as teachers, and, you know, not sort of tell them how to behave or how to teach, but to actually reflect on their capacity as teachers. And I think that has been, you know, it's brought about rich conversations. It's brought about change. It's brought about courage to try different things. And I think that's sort of the sandpit model as well. And but it does need to be guided by coaches and by middle leaders as well. So there's very much a notion of, you know, building leadership capacity throughout your school as well. And I think I would encourage other principals to look for those great teachers in your school, and how can you leverage their expertise within your own school system. So I think, you know, it's been a really exciting journey on a number of levels in that sort of building capacity, but also staff and teachers stepping into, you know, their own reflective practice as well.
Nick, one of the things that so many leaders in schools report is they're just overwhelmed by the complexity of the day-to-day, that there's so much to do, particularly after the pandemic. There's so much to do. There's so many demands. You know, sometimes you just got to get it done because you've got to manage what's happening in the day. There's all sorts of things going on. As someone who's recently joined the incubator, how are you thinking about orienting yourself as a leader, dealing with a very complex environment with a huge number of demands? How are you even starting to think about what your collective efficacy journey might be in the context of all that complexity?
That's a good question. Look, I suppose it's about, for us always here, it's about identifying those priorities and coming back to the basis for why we're here. And that's for young people to learn and progress and to exceed their potential. And for us to really understand that sometimes with all of those other pressures that we find ourselves in, perhaps the job of the leader is to decompress some of those pressures for your team and for your teaching staff especially. So we talk about that as a group of leaders that we have at our school, is how do we create space for our teachers to teach, and as John was saying, to think about their teaching, and also to be a little bit brave in, especially in our context, trying some things. So I think leaders need to juggle that really carefully, and I think also be brave within the systems in which they work, and sometimes talk to their systems with clarity around, we're going to our focuses are these priorities, and this is because of the data that we have or the journey that we're on. So I think leaders really need to be focused on how they create space for their teachers to really attend to the art of teaching, as we're talking about the science of teaching as well at the moment, but it is an art form as well in certain capacities. So giving that space, attending to real priorities, and focusing on those improvement pieces is really important as well.
John, it is wonderful to hear these leaders talk about what I think is some of the most significant leadership challenges that we face, irrespective of what sector we're in. I mean, their deep respect for the expertise in their schools, their desire to build out capability and opportunities for those staff to step into leadership roles is really the essence of what underpins collective efficacy. There's so much, John, talk about leadership and leadership development and leadership ways. Why is there so little focus on addressing, if collective efficacy is this sandpit, if it is the foundation from which to grow leadership of leaders and of people in schools, why is there not more focus on leadership development in this context in the system, do you think?
Well, I think, Liz, what we've been doing over the last many years is we've had a different dialogue. And the dialogue has been around autonomy. You have the right to teach and lead as you wish. We have a language in schools about this is my school and I do this. And we've had, in many ways, a system built around independent contractors. Well, that worked well when the society asked for that. But it's not asking for it in the same ways as it used to. It is asking for that collective. It is asking for team players. It is asking for communicators. It is asking for translators. And so that switch from I to we, from working together, from critique, to coming along to staff rooms and being open in how you think, and having that questioned, having that evaluated, having that working together. And like, we've got a long way to go, but we have to do it in a very short time. And this is where the power of notions like collective efficacy can speed up that, because our students are going to leave us behind. We're not going to prepare them for college or career readiness if we don't do this. And if we don't do it ourselves, it's very hard for the students to do it. So it's a catch up, but that catch up is now. Like, our young students are much more social media savvy. They're much more communicative. They're much more collaborative than you and I probably. I don't know about you, Liz, but certainly I ever was. And I used to take the view and get told, you got to do it yourself. You got to learn how to do it yourself. Well, there's nothing wrong with all of that, but it's not enough, and it's not the focus anymore. So, and as we have, interestingly, over the last 10 or 15 years, particularly here in Australia, like we've grown middle leadership by numbers dramatically. And as a consequence, we can't wait for each person to be great. We have to be great together. And so it's that way in which this new world has been thrust upon us, is that we need a different way of thinking about how we can take those incredible number of adults that we have had at school, from the front desk, from the teaching aides, from the middle leaders, the teachers, all of those, and have a focus together. I don't think we can keep throwing more adults at the system, hoping that we're going to solve it just one at a time. We only can solve it collectively.
One of the real challenges of the incubator has been to pin collective efficacy down, if that makes sense, to make the intangible tangible. And one of the things I think we're most proud about, Kerry, in the work we've done is developing the collective efficacy mapping tool, which we hope will make a really significant difference in allowing schools to get a read on where they are on the collective efficacy journey and provide a sort of step change platform from which to focus on what needs to happen to dial collective efficacy up in their schools. And Kerry, one of the really exciting things we're announcing in the report is a partnership we have with Rising Teams, a Silicon Valley startup, and the ed tech platform we're developing, Rising Team for Schools. Do you want to talk a little bit about the collective efficacy mapping tool, Kerry, and the ed tech Rising Team for Schools platform, and what we hope, how we hope it will contribute? Yeah.
I'm listening to everyone's discussion, and I'm thinking back to what you were saying, Nick, around courageous leaders. So I'm thinking there's something in there in terms of our essence that we were talking about before, in curiosity, intellectual humility, collective will and collective skill. There's something there about being a courageous leader in the essence of collective efficacy as well. But we can come back to that. This is a good thing about research, right? We can continue to build on our ideas and add to those. But yeah, the collective efficacy tracking tool really came out of the idea of there's surveys and different ways of kind of measuring perceptions of collective efficacy in your school. We really wanted to get to a point where we could have some discussions and conversations, and leaders could have discussions and conversations with teachers and teams in their school around the different aspects that might make up some of those elements of collective efficacy. So originally we developed, I guess, with school leaders, iterating and trialing it in their schools, a collective efficacy tracking tool, almost like a progression or a rubric type thing, where you could have a look at different elements of collective efficacy at a leader, teacher, and school level around over a progression around different elements. So the different elements that make up it are trust, shared sense of purpose, structures and supports, quality teaching and learning, and evidence-informed priorities. So people who are in schools, none of that would sound unusual to you in terms of thinking through some of the aspects that make up collective efficacy. But what's been really important, as Michelle was touching on, was the conversations that people are having around it. When we're talking about structures and supports to support our collaborative efforts, what's working well, what isn't? And having those conversations about the different aspects of how we're seeing trust play out in the school. It's not just something that just happens, but sometimes that needs to be strategically and deliberately built and attended to within the remit of what they're doing. So that's been part of it. But then us thinking about this kind of scalable, how we can't sit and work with the individual leaders through this process. We thought about it more of an accessible platform of digitising that with the group that Liz mentioned, Rising Team, and elaborating on that with a platform called Rising Team for Schools. So Rising Team for Schools is something we've piloted this year, haven't we, Liz, with a series of schools, more a functionality pilot around whether aspects of it were working, with the idea to have a full pilot next year. How it works is it's really a series of kits that teams in schools work through a kit together that takes about an hour and a half each kit. But the idea is that they can work through that with their team, and the idea is to build the strength of the team. So some of the kits are around collective efficacy, some of them are around psychological safety, appreciation, talents, conversations, all of those different aspects that might contribute to the functioning and strengthening of a team. So what we're finding is that that is something that people can use. You don't need to rely on an external consultant to come in and, you know, hit and miss in terms of the relationship you might have with them in terms of delivering that with your school. But it's something that teams have started to work around. And I know, Michelle, we've had a bit of a test within our team of having a look at that aspect of it. So the idea is next year that this will be something that we trial to across schools to see how it's working. Did you want
Michelle,
to add anything else?
How have
Liz?
you found the tool, Michelle? What's been your experience of the tool?
Yeah, so thanks, Kerry. Look, I love using the tracking tool. So I've used it sort of on 3 occasions. So right back at the start of the journey, middle of the year, and now at the end of the year. And with Kerry's encouragement, I'm going to try and heat map where we are in the school at the moment. But, you know, the flexibility of it is I can actually, you know, give it for individual teachers to a particular PLT coach so they can assess where their teachers are at. But I can also split it another way and give it to a head of faculty and have a look where the maths faculty are. But I think the other really important part of it, like any sort of matrix or criteria, is that, you know, what does success look like? So, you know, this is where I am at the moment, but you know, what is the next step? So I think that's a really important part of it as well. But I've really liked it. I think, you know, as a principal, you know, we like to measure the effectiveness of things, and this is hard to measure. It's quite difficult, and you don't really sort of have an understanding of where the school's going and where the grab is, or where more work needs to be done. So I feel like it just articulates what we're doing well. And yeah, so I'm really excited about my heat map that I'm attempting to do next week.
We'll get back to how people can join the pilot around the team in a minute, but I think one of the really other important aspects of the incubator, Kerry, has been not only making collective efficacy tangible, but really deeply understanding the skill sets required to support leaders to grow collective efficacy. So collective efficacy is a sandpit for leadership. What are the leadership attributes and skills that we need to support school leaders to develop in order to become the leaders that, you know, that make collective efficacy attainment possible and probable? And we've really come down to 2 specific types of skill sets. Nothing new, surprisingly, in the leadership development genre, but this idea about sort of technical skills, particularly, Kerry, this transformational organisational change skill sets, which frankly in corporate Australia are just expected and built into managerial leadership development as a given, but not necessarily treated or thought about in the same way in the context of the education system. And then absolutely these more these adaptive skills, which is about stages of development, leading in complexity, multiple perspective taking, these other sorts of things that allow people to think more at a systems level in terms of how they work in their leaderships. And there seems to be something, Kerry, a significant opportunity to think about the relationship between building out that transformational organisational capability, because schools are in constant flux with constant demands and constant change agendas, and also cultivating these higher order adaptive skills. Perhaps could you just spend a few minutes giving us a sense of how you're seeing that playing out in the incubator and the priority of that as a key area of focus going forward?
I think it comes back to that earlier insight around leadership and leadership development and it being intentional and deliberate, right? So when we talk it through and we talk through some of the aspects that you're talking about, Liz, we have, you know, different things that we can go to. We've got leadership standards and different capability frameworks and things like that. But what we're talking about here is really a progression of leadership. So if we're in a school setting, if we're thinking about all the different we've got aspiring leaders, middle leaders, etc. in our school, we're thinking about this progression of not a binary, you know, adaptive and technical skill set, but we're thinking about both of them. What are the skills that might underpin the development of collective efficacy? We propose in the report kind of 5 leadership domains. None of it will be new to people in terms of understanding collective efficacy, systems leadership, change leadership, team leadership, collaborative capacity, but thinking about us starting to articulate what are the skill sets that lie underneath there, and what might a progression of those skills look like in terms of those technical and adaptive skills. Because I think some of that framing, being able to frame and identify, it'd help us. I'm looking at you, Nick, Karen, Michelle. It would help us to think about, well, what are the skill sets that I need to help my leaders to develop through to, managing a particular project and getting that to fruition, through to, how they might work with their team and gather multiple perspectives across their team, and then arrive at some consensus around that. So, there's a range of skills that sit underneath these layers. And what we've started to do is started to think about what they are, started to articulate some of those, but there's still work to do, right? Part of the challenge is starting to think about, well, what are these? And then what might look like in terms of the progression of leadership development.
And so, Kerry, the idea is that we're going to think about a sort of the wraparound digitised leadership development platform that aligns with the tools to build out the relationship between those transformational organisational skill sets and the adaptive skill sets, as we get this more complete picture of how to lead for collective efficacy is sort of where we're heading, aren't we?
Yeah.
John, can I just ask, how are you seeing the sort of articulation and delineation of those really specific leadership type skill sets sitting around this bigger question around collective efficacy? There's so much, as I said, John, before, it just, from the foundation's point of view, when we looked in at school leadership, there's so much activity around school leadership, and yet there's still a fundamental question, I think, about the best way to go forward to cultivate and offer leaders in schools the opportunity to build these really necessary skills to address, the really significant challenge of what it is to lead a school these days. How are you seeing that coalescing, John?
Well, it's moving on all 3 fronts that you and Kerry addressed before. It's putting that massive focus on the thinking, it's the process, the implementation, and it's also the toolkit. And sometimes we get one of those 3 problems focused on and solved, and then the other 2 fall over. And the hard thing about collective efficacy is you can't do it by yourself. It's a contradiction to even try. Whereas many in the times in the past, we've implored leaders, you need to do this. We've had all those people emulated from the business community that have transformed as if they did it by themselves. Well, we're in a business where it's the antithesis of that. And we've got away with not having to deal with in the past because we've had a smaller focus and a narrow focus. Sadly or wonderfully, the community has put so much more obligation on us. And we know even in COVID, we've amplified the social and emotional side of things as well as the learning. So we keep adding, and we get to this point where either we have a breakup or a breakthrough. And so I say to you in Menzies, you've tackled the hardest problem, you've tackled the toughest. And I hate to tell you this, you're going to have to help us soon because the current system is not going to be sustainable. And so when I have seen it in action, and as Nick said, I've been up in his school, it's stunning. The mood, the ethos, the sense that we're all in this together. The fact that staff rooms aren't places you come and you just relax. You come and that's where a lot of the real work happens. And I just think it's fascinating, Liz, that amongst the most strongest influences that we have on students, on their outcomes, on their equity, on the emotional, on their learning, the social, is a function of what we do, not them. And I just think it should ripple through. And going back to the analogy, this should be the biggest virus sweep through the system. So, Menzies, we've all tried it. We've not really had a lot of success. We have pockets of success, but I think that the work you're doing and how it scales up may be the most critical thing that we do in the next decade.
John, that's so nice. I feel warmed by your ambition for us, John. We all feel slightly daunted in the incubator a lot, don't we, Kerry? But I feel warmed by your ambition. Just before we get on to, because I'm really conscious of the time, and to be honest, I will ask for a few questions, but I'm a little nervous as someone running the panel. I'm going to manage the questions as well. But nevertheless, if you've got any questions, please pop them in. But just before we go into how you can connect with our work, I'd love to ask, if I can, Nick and Karen and Michelle, can you give me the 2 or 3 skills that you've, be they technical skills or adaptive skills, what are the 2 or 3 skills that you've, through your work in the incubator, really sought to cultivate as leaders? What have been the ones that have been a revelation for you? Let's start with you, Karen, because you've been here the longest. What are the 1 or 2 skills that you really think that you've got a new focus on or a new lens in regard to its importance?
I think the absolute first, and I'm truly grateful to the Menzies for this, is engaging deeply in your own reflective practice to have that clearer understanding of what you do as a leader that might get in the way of the collective practice of your team. Now, it seems counterintuitive when you're talking about fostering and believing and, you know, striving for collective efficacy, but exactly what John said, in lots of cases, all of our leadership training is very much that you are now the architect of the things that are going to happen in your school. And so you talk about collective efficacy on one hand, and on the other hand, you have these overarching driving forces that are perhaps innate, that actually cloister the development of collective efficacy in your school. And so one of the things for me personally is engaging very deeply in reflective practice and encouraging our other middle leaders to do exactly the same with, honesty and authenticity. That would be my absolute first go-to one. And then the second one is having the courage, and I think it's courage, to co-construct the plans that you want to make. And I think I want to hark back to what Nick was saying there. It's when you come together with that willingness to collaborate and co-plan, you actually create the space to quiet out. It is complex right now. It is more complex now, I think, than ever before. But when you work in that way, you can quiet out white noise and focus on what matters, and be quite clear about where you're directing your energy and your work. So they would be my top 2.
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to you, Michelle. You next. Your 2?
Look, I think my first one is probably where I started. You need to have a persuasive language about your sense of purpose. You know, if you want teachers to go with you, you need to be able to persuade them too. So there's an element of marketing here that you need to do with your teachers as well, but be really clear in how you articulate your sense of purpose in your school and what you want that language of learning to look like. And then the other thing is you've got to be really strategic with how you strike that balance with a deep dive into what's happening in the classrooms in your school. But at the same time, you want to be building confidence with your teachers as well. So even though they might feel a bit exposed with that deep dive, you want to invite them into the conversation about that reflective practice. So that's a really strategic balance with who you put together and how you guide those conversations as well. So there's a level of strategy in the structures that sit behind what you're trying to achieve. So I sort of think that persuasive language around your sense of purpose, and that really strategic balance with, inviting, but also doing a deep dive at the same time. That's difficult. Yeah.
Nick, over to you.
Well, I'm early in my journey, but I think the things that have stood out to me, and one key takeaway, talking to Aidan early on, he talked about how do you show up. I've taken that to heart and working on that. But I love the, collective efficacy talked about creating a narrative and building that narrative around why we're doing what we're doing together. So working on that narrative, and then also just looking at the skills that are around you, and with that, that humility and that humble approach, saying, hey, I've got to harvest the skills and the capabilities of the teachers that are around me to cultivate, the best learning environment that we can for young people. So they're probably the key things that I'll be focusing on moving forward, and probably the key things that I've taken away to this point.
Kerry, we're near the end. perhaps can you share how people can join us?
I knew you were going to ask me that, and I don't know if I know the technicalities of how people get access to things. I'm sure Sarah,
there's links in the report, Kerry. There's links in the report.
There's links in the report of how people can join us. We're really interested in having conversations with people, but also people interested in working with us and taking action. As Liz just mentioned, we're going to be running a pilot next year. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to us. We'll be also running a series of a webinar series next year as well. But for those who are interested in further research or, some of the direction that other people are heading in, we're really keen to work with people and learn with others as well, because we know this isn't separate work to what other people are doing, and we're really keen to, I guess, build that collective efficacy more broadly, around how we might work together and learn from each other to better all outcomes, we'll say, across Australia. We'll stick with Australia for now, but yeah.
I love to see Kerry's ambitious too, John. John, I'm going to give you the final word.
Well, in our life, we can take on the easy problems and do them well, or we can take the hard problems, and we might fail. And we may make lots of mistakes, but it's learning from that failure, it's learning from those errors, and it's what you've been doing over the last years. When I first met you, Liz, in the Menzies Foundation some years ago, you were imploring what's the hard problems here, what's going to make the difference, and the challenge on your plate is the right challenge. And so the fact that you've joined up with the profession, and today, Michelle, Nick and Karen, the fact that you're working with people like Kerry and Catherine and others building this, and how you then have this ambition to scale up. And I think that's the message out there. And I encourage everybody to read the report. It's the culmination of a lot of thinking, a lot of hard work, a lot of errors, a lot of failures, a lot of success, but also realizing that collective efficacy, as everyone has said today, it's not just a thing. It's a way of being. And that way of being encapsulates so much about what's so valuable. So I'll be watching very closely over the next few years as the incubator increases, scales up. And I really ask that all people read the report, give the feedback, and watch the space.
Absolutely, John. Watch this space. Can I just say on behalf of the foundation, John, we're just so grateful for your connection, commitment, and contribution to us. You are such an important figure in the Australian educational landscape, and to have your support makes an enormous difference to our work. Can I acknowledge the work, Kerry, of you and all the members of the incubator, both in the past, current, and in the future? And just on behalf of the foundation, say it really is hard work to work deeply, collaboratively, curiously, and fearlessly. And I have to say, I think that all our people in the incubator exhibit all of those qualities pretty well all the time, which is an enormous credit to the collaboration partners and to the advisory board that supports us. And most importantly of all, Karen, Michelle, and Nick, as three representatives of our extraordinary Menzies Fellows, can I thank you so genuinely for, I think, the really enormous contribution you're making, not only in your own schools, but so gratefully from my point of view in terms of what you contribute to the incubator and all that you bring, and your aspiration and wishes for other leaders in the profession. So I'd just like to acknowledge you as outstanding leaders and to thank you very much for that contribution. And so I'm 2 minutes early. It's a miracle. The report will be distributed immediately and will be available. As Kerry says, we are so hopeful that others will connect with us, will connect with the work, will think about joining the pilot, will come on this journey with us. There is no leadership challenge in this country more than to find better ways to support those people who lead in our schools, who, as John says, have our children in their hands to boot. And on behalf of the Menzies Foundation, the Incubator, and the School Leadership Fellows, thank you for joining us today, and we very much look forward to the next conversation. Good afternoon.